All right, so we finished up our notes on Eli last Wednesday night, but we didn't get to the questions. So we're going to cover the questions on Eli, and then we're going to move on to our notes on the Centurions in the New Testament. So starting with question 1, what lesson or lessons can we learn from Eli's interactions with Hannah back in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel? I think there's a... Okay, so that's at least one. Eli jumped to a conclusion without knowing all the facts. I don't think Hannah had ever shown a propensity to be drunk, so it's not like this had happened before, in which case you could kind of understand Eli jumping to that conclusion. It doesn't sound as though Hannah had ever met Eli or vice versa, or had actually interaction before. But Eli kind of just assumed that she was drunk. He condemns her in chapter 1. In fact, he's pretty harsh about it, actually. In verse 14, how long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. So he doesn't just ask her if she's drunk. He assumes and then goes on to kind of condemn her for being drunk when she wasn't. But what's another lesson we can learn? Other people were doing. That could be. We know there were some events going on with his sons and some of the women outside of the tabernacle. It's interesting that Eli's sitting there. So I don't know if maybe that had something to do with it as well. But that could be. That could be. Maybe he was trying to be prudent in some of what he was doing. What else? Say what now? That's exactly. Yeah, in verse 15 and 16, she explains, I'm not drunk. Here's what the situation. She doesn't go into the whole detail, but she's praying because she's in grief. And in verse 17, Eli, he believes her, first of all. He acknowledges that, and then he seems sympathetic to her. He says, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you've asked of him. Again, I don't think Eli had any special dispensation or power to grant prayers that had been asked. He doesn't know, at least we're not told, that Hannah explains what she was asking for. But Eli says this, and Hannah takes it as a blessing that God's going to do this. And of course, God does do that. But yeah, Eli is quick to reverse course when he finds out she's not drunk, and he's very sympathetic towards her. So obviously, the first point would be to not jump to conclusions, to judge according to righteous judgment, as Jesus made the case in John chapter 7, to get all the facts, make sure you understand what's going on, and then judge what the situation is according to God's word. But in this event, when one finds that they have misjudged the situation, be quick to acknowledge that and reverse course. Be sympathetic or whatever needs to be done. But I think that's those are some good lessons we can learn from Eli there. Anything else? Question 2. What lessons can we learn from Eli's rebuke but not restraint of his sons? This goes into chapter 2 and chapter 3. Say again? Okay, it doesn't sound as though he was a very big disciplinarian. He gave them a stern talking to in chapter 2. And whether or not this is something he had done on a regular occasion as they were growing up, I don't know. But this is obviously not something that, I said chapter 2, chapter 3, it should be, I guess. No, it was in chapter 2. Did I just miss it here? Yep, chapter 2, they were messing with the sacrifices. I think was it not here when he, verse 22? Yep, verse 22, thank you. I knew it was in there somewhere. I skipped it. So we see that in verse 23, he says, why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings. Verse 24, no, my sons, it's not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. And in verse 25, they did not heed the voice of their father because the Lord desired to kill them. Of course, we talked about that. But it's one of those aspects, had they just kind of learned to tune their father out because he was all bark and no bite? Was this something that had just kind of gradually happened? And sometimes that's how it works. It's not something that's overnight necessarily. It's one of those things that kind of gradually happens. And maybe Eli just, before he knew it, his sons were off on the wayside here, and there was really nothing he could do about it. But the Lord specifically condemns Eli for not having restrained them. Ben?
I mean, it feels like there's no fault.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
At this point, they're old enough to fornicate.
Yeah.
And they're grown-ups. So
Kind of hard at this point.
it's not like you can just take them out and whoop them.
Yeah.
But in his position,
Mhm.
you have to do something to remove them from duties or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. You're right. I don't know what if a priest, you would think there would be definite allowance under the law to remove a priest who was actively sinning, doing things they ought not. Eli, first of all, didn't do that. Even at this point, he wasn't willing to stop them. And I think definitely that would have been, even if, let's say Eli had done everything perfect when they were younger, and then as they grew older, they just did their own thing, Eli continued to allow that to happen. While they're supposed to be priests serving the people, serving God in the tabernacle, and yet they're causing people to transgress and so forth. And like you said, there had to have been some sort of avenue he could have taken to remove them from service or some kind of punishment for what they had done. I don't know, but he didn't do it. And the Lord specifically says, because you did not restrain them, or because he did not restrain them when he spoke to Samuel. Other comments? Yes, sir.
Footnote, I always thought that word restraint meant restraint, but a footnote that shows it as being didn't frown upon them.
He didn't frown upon them.
Well, I don't know which one is accurate. I just noticed that footnote, and so obviously you could not have, like you said, physically probably could not restrain them.
Yeah.
And perhaps at this point, it's already to the fact that he's kind of reverted back and is doing some of the same things, eating of the meat and so
Right.
forth, that they've been doing. So
Yeah.
perhaps at this point, that's kind of the implication. I don't know, but
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting.
Of course, there would be, I guess you could extend that because he didn't frown upon them, he didn't do anything to stop them. There's a couple components, but he did, he did condemn them for what they were doing, at least as it pertained to the fornication with the ladies in the tabernacle. But at the same time, he didn't restrain them. So I think there are some lessons there, at the very least, of acknowledging and understanding, of course, as parents, especially when our kids are young, making sure we teach them that there are consequences to their actions. It may not necessarily have to be always spanking, it could be grounding, whatever. Different avenues are more effective for some kids than others. Spanking doesn't work for all kids sometimes, especially depending on what age they are. Sometimes doing something a little bit different will have more of an impact. It's just kind of depending on the child. But certainly making sure we're not just all bark and no bite, and then our kids learn that, well, they kind of talk big, but they're not going to really do anything, so I'll do what I want to. And, they can yell at me if they want, but nothing's going to happen. Pam?
As priests, they're looked up to in a leadership role, and if that's not being followed through there at the temple, and the leaders aren't doing what they're supposed to do, that's just going to filter down to the people, and they're going to go left.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, and we see that on a regular occasion, especially when Israel ends up having kings. Okay, you have good kings, all of a sudden the people are going to do what's right. Then they have bad kings, and all the people are going to do what's wrong. Well, not all of them. There's always a remnant, but a lot of the people will do what's wrong. And so you kind of have that, they follow the leader type of mentality, and that might have been happening here as well. Yeah. Anything else through question 2?
It doesn't stop right there. You see the New Testament, the hypocritical actions of
Yeah.
Pharisees, and,
Yeah.
they're acting,
Well, and
people are looking up to them and seeing them not practicing what they preach.
well, and it seemed like there was a Jewish pattern of redefining the issue for themselves than it was defining the issue for others. Because Paul, even in Romans chapter 2, has to address the fact that you're condemning the Gentiles for one thing, but you are in essence doing the exact same things. And you're not condemning yourself for that. And so even in Romans chapter 2, he condemns the Jewish brethren for hypocritical judgment and condemning the Gentiles when they're doing the same stuff. Do you think you'll escape? You who preach against such things and do the same? All right, question 3. What do you make of Eli's statement about the Lord's right to do what he will in chapter 3 and in verse 18? It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. Again, when we talked about this particular verse, it doesn't sound like he's being sarcastic, and it doesn't sound like he's angry or upset about it. It's almost like he's consigned to recognize that this is what God decides, and whatever he decides, so it shall be. How would you have reacted? If something like this had been said to you, the Lord's angry with you, the Lord's going to bring judgment on your house, so forth.
He knew what was going on.
He knew what was happening.
There's no sense of putting on a dumb act at that point.
No, yeah.
I mean, I like to think I would have repented in sackcloth and ashes and hoped that he would stay his mind from doing those things. But that's just.
Yeah, well, and I thought about Jonah and the city of Nineveh. Okay, when Jonah was preaching to the city of Nineveh, did Jonah, in fact, do we see any suggestion that if they were to repent, God would stay his hand from judging them? We don't. In fact, the king of Nineveh makes the statement, let us repent, perhaps Jehovah will stay his hand. Because it wasn't like Jonah was teaching that. In fact, Jonah fully expected God to follow through with judgment on those people. But because they repented, God changed his mind. Now, granted, earlier, God makes a statement that no amount of sacrifices is going to change this. No amount of penitent hearts or tears is going to stop me from doing this. But if I'm Eli, and I'm not necessarily saying this as a condemnation to Eli. Eli is consigned to what's going to happen. He understands that this is God's right to make this decision. But and maybe this is kind of more of a trained thought process under the law of Christ, as it would have been necessarily under the old law. But my first instinct would have been to pray, to acknowledge that God, you have your right, and not necessarily to ask Him not to do these things, because I deserve it, okay, and my sons deserve it. But at the same time, at the very least, I can recognize that I was wrong. I can show repentance for what I had done, do whatever I could to at least, recognize that you're right, Lord. Well, this is wrong, and you do as what seems best to you. And maybe he did after verse 18. It's not told to us that he did. Maybe he did after he said this, but it's just kind of struck me that there is that recognition that it is God's right. He will do what seems good to him. Not that Eli disagreed. Not that Eli didn't think it was good, but it's God's right to choose what He will. It just kind of strikes me that there's not a lot of reaction there from what's recorded for us. Thoughts? No. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would have been fearful that God had, and He didn't speak to me. He spoke to Samuel and then passed the message on to me. Of course, the man of God had come, whoever that was. We're not recorded a name, and he warned me, and now God has warned me through Samuel. And well, I say warning. It's not really a warning. It's this is what's going to happen. It's judgment. Yeah. Well, I don't know what you would do for that. What could you do? I don't know. As a priest, but under the law, of course, God says no amount of sacrifice is going to fix it. But for Samuel's own soul, you would think that there would have been something. Yeah. Nolan?
Seems we think differently about things at different stages or ages of life. Perhaps if he were a young man and heard this, he'd think, I can change and help lead the nation and do whatever.
Could be.
He seems to be very close into his life. He's old.
Yep.
And
Yep.
So to me, he's just looking at God's making a change in the priesthood, and it's a resignation of
Yep.
it's time for it to go. If God says that's what's needed,
Well, and a component to this is there's nothing he could do. He couldn't stop his sons, whether or not he had the authority to do so at this point. Remember, we talked about the possibility he may have resigned as high priest and allowed Phinehas to become high priest. He may not have had the authority to do anything at this point, but he did at one time. That's why God says you didn't restrain them. So at this point, in his age and in the situation in his life, at this point, it's just one of those things that there's not a single thing I can do about it. It could be. Could be. Anything else through that? Next question. Which do you suppose caused more grief to Eli, the death of his sons or the capture of the ark?
what it says, he reacted more to the heart.
Absolutely. Well, even before, in chapter 4, before he hears word about what happened in the battle, he was worried, not about his sons, he was worried about the ark. And so in verse, let's see, we see that in verse 11, verse 13. Here's Eli, he's on by the wayside watching. His heart trembled for the ark of God. He hasn't heard anything about the results of the battle yet, but he's worried about the ark. You combine that with the fact that God had told him, both your sons are going to die on one day. Both my sons are at this battle. You put two and two together, and he had right to be concerned, but it was about the ark. And that still shows where his mind is, where his heart is. It's about the service of the Lord. It's about the Ark of the Covenant. It's about the priesthood and the service in the tabernacle. He's worried about the ark. Now, having said that, is God going to take care of his ark? God's going to take care of his ark, okay? He's going to take care of it very well, as we're going to see in chapter 5 and chapter 6 with the Philistines. But he's worried about it leaving Israel, I think, is kind of more the focus. He's worried about the ark leaving Israel, and that's exactly what happens. So yeah, he's more worried about the ark, but why would this be? Why would he be more worried about the ark than he would his own sons?
The ark was holding his Israel.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, his sons were vile, we're told. Okay, kind of the same concept of an abomination of what they were doing. And the ark, and the fact that the ark was holy at that point. This is where God would sit on the Day of Atonement in the mercy seat. This is something that was not just important to Eli. This was important to all of Israel.
The ark held hope if his sons had been leading the people astray.
Yeah. And as long as the ark was with Israel, at the very least, Israel could appeal to Jehovah, they could entreat him, they could go and offer sacrifices on the Day of Atonement and so forth. But if the ark was taken, then what? Then what do we do? It's almost as if Israel loses hope, because at that point, for some, at least for some of Israel, the ark represented Jehovah. Even the Philistines, well, their God has just come into the camp when the ark was brought. And so now that the ark is taken away, it's like Jehovah's gone. And in a way, it is symbolic that God had, turned his back at least on Eli and his sons and so forth, but not necessarily on all of Israel, although certainly they suffered in battle because of it. Anything else through that one?
Well, God had prophesied that sons were going to die, so it wasn't like that was
Can't.
surprising.
Yeah.
It's still not, I can't even imagine hearing that news, but
Yeah.
still, it wasn't like that was a surprise.
Right.
The same token, this is all one sentence that the messenger speaks, at least in English.
Yeah.
And I'm not disagreeing that it is at the point that the ark is mentioned, but it's all together in one sentence. Your two sons have died and the ark is. So, I mean, it's not like there's at least from the reading of it,
Yeah.
there's not like a huge amount of
Well,
Your sons are died, and now let's talk about everything else that happened. And then, oh, by the way, at the end of the ark, it's all one. Your 2 sons died, and this is what happened to the ark. So, I mean,
well, it's interesting because in verse 18, what we're told, it happened when he made mention of the ark of God that Eli fell off the seat backward. So it's almost as if, yeah, it was all in one sentence here in verse 17 that Hophni and Phinehas and the ark has been captured. But it's as if that the record is making a point to emphasize, verse 18, that it was the mentioning of the ark that was the major blow. Not that the death of his 2 sons wasn't a blow at all. But it would seem as though the reference here to the ark of God, that at that point is when Eli kind of just faints or just kind of goes into shock and falls over. But that's what, he was worried about that to start with. He was worried about the ark to start with. And now his fears have been confirmed. The ark has been taken. And it would seem, at least in terms of the weightier of the two, it would seem the ark was perhaps the weightier of them. But between both of them all at once, certainly that was a blow in and of itself. Yeah.
That's my point, is maybe that was just the last straw.
It could be.
The ark.
Because that is the last thing. That is the last thing that it mentions. Yeah. Yeah. You're right.
in reality, he's responsible for all of that. I mean,
Yeah.
in essence, because of his leadership role and so forth.
Right.
That the sons have not been what they were supposed to be, to an extent that he didn't do his job as a parent, apparently,
Yeah.
well enough.
Right. Right. As a leader, at least. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Last question. What characteristics should we not seek to emulate from Eli? And it goes together. What characteristics should we seek to emulate? I think being the proper spiritual examples is a key component. Again, we have no idea what had happened in Eli's past when his kids were young and so forth. We don't know that. But at the very least, his leadership even later in life was still lacking, it would seem. Okay, because there's serious suggestions to that end. So being a good leader, both whether it's as a husband, as a father, or as a wife and a mother, being good spiritual leaders, being good spiritual examples, leading out and showing. I mean, because sometimes once our kids are grown, they leave the house, they do their own thing. I mean, we can't ground them at that point. You know, what can we do? Well, we can talk to them. We can continue to show the right example, show the right mindset that we're supposed to have. Continue to talk to them about doing what's right. Those are things that we can do. And whether or not Eli did those the way he should have, we don't know necessarily. It wouldn't seem that he did. That would be one thing I think we could take from that. Certainly making sure you get all the information before you come to a conclusive judgment about it, going so far as to condemn somebody for something that you assumed was happening, when in fact that wasn't the reality. Okay, that's a key component as well. But also being sympathetic, recognizing that when somebody's is sincere in their sorrow, sincere in their grief, as Hannah was, for instance. Certainly we recognize with Eli the understanding and the resignation of God is going to do what seems good to him. Okay, whatever that is, I submit to whatever that is. Eli doesn't really say that, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, basically what Eli is conveying is that it is the Lord. He'll do what seems good to him. And first of all, there's nothing I can do about it. But second of all, I acknowledge that he has that power, he has that wisdom, and he has that right. Certainly would be something that we could emulate from that. What else? Yeah.
Possibly a tie-in to the New Testament, the leadership role that an elder is in.
Yep.
His qualifications, whether, there's a lot of good men out there. Eli may have been,
Yep.
a good man, but he didn't have a lot of all the qualities
Right.
that make him a leader.
Right.
Just like in the New Testament, an elder, or today, an
Yep.
elder today, needs to have all of the qualifications, not most of them.
That
They're supposed to have all.
that's a great point.
Be a leadership position of someone looking up to them.
Yeah.
They've got their life mostly all
Right, right. And I think that's a very important point, especially in a world where you've got pastors, quote unquote, who are basically evangelists who are in charge of the church, and there's only one. I mean, you have that whole process of how the church is to be led completely turned upside down by man. God, in His wisdom, has designated a pattern that we're supposed to follow, and He has good reasons for that. And those reasons are conveyed very clearly in the Bible. And having that leadership role, having that role of a shepherd, and yet at the same time the role of a shepherd would kind of be the more of a pastor. That's the pastoral part of being an elder. But then you've got the bishop, or kind of the oversight that you have going on. Then the elder would be the concept of the responsibility involved, the leadership role. All of those are different aspects of that same role. And you're right. Yeah, Eli, as I think he was a good man. Okay, he would seem to have been a good man. I think he had the right concern for the ark and the spiritual matters for the most part, but he wasn't, it would not seem, based on what we have, it wouldn't seem he was the best spiritual leader, at least later in age. Again, we don't know what happened prior to all this, but at least later in life, he may not have been.
Despite his flaws as a parent of his own children, he seems to have done a better job with the time he had with Samuel.
Yes.
And in fact, he points Samuel specifically to God.
Yes.
Not himself, which would have been a tempting thing as the leader at that time.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. When we saw in chapter 3 that Eli didn't show any kind of anger towards Samuel, that God was speaking to Samuel. He didn't show any jealousy. He simply helped Samuel. He basically helped raise him for the most part, and train him in the ways of the Lord. All of that being the case, I mean, it would seem Eli was a good parental mentor, however you want to say it, role for Samuel growing up. Yeah. Nolan?
Dovetail, tie that back into question 1, his dealings with Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
After he gets straight, what she's doing, and she's not drunk and all this, he helps fulfill, I mean, he says to God, grant your wish. But he's got to accept this challenge and saying, you're crazy, lady. Nobody turns their kid over and leaves him here.
Right.
On the steps of the tabernacle.
Right.
I mean, he takes him in, as Joe just talked about.
Absolutely.
Takes on that role.
And he doesn't seem to question it at all. You're right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a huge responsibility. As parents know, that's a huge responsibility. I mean, his mom and dad would come once a year at least to the tabernacle, but I mean, for the rest of the time, it's Eli. And again, we talked about how old his sons may have been. He may have been so old that Samuel didn't really have any dealings with them so much as it was Eli. And in some ways, if Eli is as we kind of give the impression that he was, Eli may have thought to himself, "This is my second chance. This is a second chance to raise a son, so to speak." And it seems like he did a good job. Yeah. Anything else?
Just kind of cut in with that a little more. Saul,
Mm-hmm.
when he knew he was going to be replaced, he tried to get rid of the person that was going to do that.
Yeah.
And not that Samuel was replacing Eli so much, but he's going to go on living and Eli isn't.
Yeah.
There's no hint of jealousy here.
Right.
The Lord's going to do this one.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but it was it was at the end of chapter 3 that everybody began to recognize that that he was a prophet. Yeah, verse 20. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. And again, at no point is it suggested that Eli ever was a prophet, that God had ever spoken directly to him. It was what we have, at least the record of it, is the man of God came in chapter 2, Samuel here in chapter 3, and it was rare in those days. Earlier in chapter 3, it was rare for the word of the Lord to come to people. And so it would seem, that just adds to that fact that it's kind of Samuel's star is rising, so to speak. It's not Samuel's star so much, but Samuel's kind of rising in influence and to a certain extent, I guess you could say authority as it would pertain to being a prophet. And Eli's he's coming down. And his sons, his house is going down compared to Samuel. And it doesn't seem like there was any jealousy, any hatred, any anger, that it just he was consigned to the fact that this is the Lord's will. It certainly would have, books of Samuel would have read quite differently if Saul had had that same attitude, wouldn't it? Very differently. All right, anything else? All right, let's move on to our notes on the centurions. We have four centurions that we want to look at. Two of them are named, two of them are unnamed. But I figured, given the fact that there are several examples of centurions in the New Testament, and these are centurions of which there is some stuff said about them, these four in particular, that putting them all in one set of notes would be conducive to the type of study we're doing. So, the first one, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on Cornelius because we've talked about Cornelius quite a bit in the past. But talking about Cornelius, he's only mentioned, at least as far as his name Cornelius is, it's only in chapter 10. He's referenced in chapter 11, and there's a couple other references as well referring to the event where Peter goes to Cornelius and teaches them and baptizes him and his household. But Cornelius is only mentioned here in chapter 10. And we're told a little bit about Cornelius's character. And based on his character, first of all, we know that he's part of the Italian regiment. It's actually known outside of biblical sources as well, that particular regiment that was stationed in Caesarea. In verse 2 is kind of where we find a lot of the references to his character as well. There's four things that are mentioned in verse 2 regarding his character, which we'll get to in just a minute. But chapter 10 marks the first time that a full Gentile, not a proselyte, not a Samaritan, which were kind of hybrid type, half Gentile, half Jew type thing, is the first time that a full Gentile is shown to be able to be saved without needing to be circumcised or obedient to the law of Moses. And so this is what ultimately leads to chapter 11 and verse 18, when Peter, after he's having to defend basically why did you go to this Gentile in his house, to the elders at the church in Jerusalem, he says, this is what happened. And in verse 18, the brethren, they realize, well, God has granted to the Gentiles the ability to be saved just as we have. And so for the first time, it would seem, as of chapter 11, chapter 10 and chapter 11, is the recognition that it's not just somebody who is a Jew who's been circumcised. It doesn't have to be just a proselyte who would have been circumcised. It doesn't have to be just a Samaritan who, a lot of them, I believe, they followed circumcision as well. Even a full Gentile who isn't necessarily a proselyte, isn't a Samaritan, who doesn't really have any component to or attachment to Jehovah, he can be saved in the same manner as the Jews on the day of Pentecost were. And they didn't have to be circumcised. This provides an understanding, though, why in Acts chapter 15, those false teachers who were going around teaching the Gentiles that they needed to be circumcised before they could be saved, that's why that was such a big deal. Okay, because for a period of time, it would seem that was the thought process. But now, as of chapter 10 and chapter 11, the realization is, no, that's not how this works. God has shown that anyone can be saved through baptism. They don't have to be attached to the Mosaic law. They don't have to be circumcised. So chapter 15, it's almost like these false teachers were undoing the progress that God had shown or revealed to the saints, and that's why it was so important to correct that in chapter 15. Thoughts or comments on that? And that's why chapter 10's that's one of the reasons it's such a big deal, is that it shows that all Gentiles can be saved in the same way. There are some traditions that hold that Cornelius later became an elder in the church at Caesarea. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Again, that's not mentioned in the New Testament, but that was discussed in terms of some of the background traditions and histories that have been recorded about Cornelius, that he became an elder at the church of Caesarea. And I'd love to think that was the case. I mean, he and his whole house were saved. So certainly, certainly he has the character of one, as we're going to see, that would have probably made a very good elder. That would have been great if that's what happened. Right?
Wouldn't have made him a proselyte.
Right.
I wonder how he knew God.
The thought process, this is the only real connection that I know of, although we know that the Jews are aware of him.
Versus false thought,
Right, right,
which that went on very common in the Gentiles.
right.
So,
There was someone who settled in Caesarea, however, who was an evangelist. You all remember who it was? Philip. Yeah, he had 4 daughters who prophesied. It's possible that he had at least heard about Jehovah. Now, whether or not he heard about Christ or anything else, certainly he had a good reputation among the Jews, we're told. So he was involved, first of all, in the community. We know that. We know there was a synagogue in Caesarea. So there was, there may have been some interaction in terms of Jehovah through interactions with the Jews. It could be that he heard about the church or heard about Jehovah from just people talking about the way that would have made it to Caesarea as Philip had settled there. So I don't think he had been taught, because it would seem that this is the first time he's being taught, especially about Christ, but he did know of Jehovah. Whether it was from a Jewish source or from an aspect of understanding Jewish society or culture or whatever, whether it was from hearing maybe secondhand about this Jehovah of the way that they worship or something like that, I don't know. But we know he doesn't have details on Christ, it wouldn't seem. Okay? But he does know of Jehovah, enough that he has so much faith and trust in him that he does what he does. So there's a whole lot there, but he must have been taught to some extent or must have learned somehow, but there's nothing that suggests he was a proselyte. Nothing that suggests that he had been circumcised or anything else. In fact, that would defeat the point. that would actually not really make the case at all. Everybody recognized that this man is a full Gentile. So how he knew about Jehovah, from what source, I don't know. Joe?
With a quick contrast, something like Eli, who was a Jewish priest, who should have known God and his family, they were about.
Yeah. And his sons did not know, God.
Here's a guy's a Gentile who fears God with all his household.
Yeah.
It was quite the contrast.
Yeah. And that's a point too, is that it's not just Cornelius, it was his whole household. So Cornelius, either they were all informed about Jehovah at some point, or Cornelius taught his family to fear Jehovah. There had to have been some information at some point that was conveyed to him. Just the reason I say that is, you would think, though, if it had been from Jewish sources, you would think Cornelius would have been moved to become a proselyte. You would think that's what he would have done, but he didn't. So that's why it makes you wonder about, well, what about whatever Christian influence may have existed in Caesarea? Again, I don't know, but it was enough, whatever source he learned Jehovah from, it was enough to spur him to fear Jehovah, and yet he wasn't a proselyte. And it may be, keep in mind too, that as a centurion in his position, maybe he couldn't become a proselyte. Maybe there was some sort of rule or law or cultural issue there that would prevent him from becoming a proselyte. Maybe that explains that. I don't know.
Well, verse 22, he's of good report among all the Jews.
Of all the Jews.
And I'm sure he's heard of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You would think that his interaction with the Jews would have affected that as well. Anything else? All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up with the Centurions not next Wednesday. Next Wednesday's singing night. The Wednesday after that. So 2 weeks from tonight, we will pick up with the Centurions. Thanks, everybody.